So this is the first section for Judaism, which is the significant personality, and our personality is Martin Buber. And this first video is looking at the Hasidim, because we need to understand the Hasidim to understand Martin Buber, and a brief overview of Martin Buber's background. So the areas we look at in terms of the Hasidim is we look at the founding of the Hasidim, what the situation in Eastern Europe where Hasidim came from. We look at Baal Shem Tov, we look at the Jews of Eastern Europe, the teachings of Hasidim and the spread of Hasidim, and then Hasidim today. So the first thing we need to look at is the founding of Hasidim. Hasidim is a movement within Judaism, so it's a group of people who followed the same sort of ideals within Judaism. And it was founded by a guy called Baal Shem Tov, and it came out of the Eastern European area where a lot of Jewish people were living at this time. So we're talking about the 18th century, which is the 1700s, particularly the late 1700s. And a lot of factors had happened during this period which had allowed these circumstances to come to pass where we had this movement form and grow. It's now considered an ultra-Orthodox movement within Judaism, which means they're very traditional in their approach, but in a lot of ways they're very different to a lot of other Orthodox Jews as well. So Hasidim was founded by a man called Baal Shem Tov, who was a Jewish rabbi in 18th century Eastern Europe, and his name is sometimes shortened to the Besht, where we get the B there and the SHE there and the T there. He's sometimes called the Besht. And he was born in 1698 in an area which is now called the Ukraine. It wasn't the Ukraine back then. And he ended up being a labourer in the mountains, doing very difficult work. But he also did some study as a Jewish mystic, which meant he looked at some of these mystical practices that were within Judaism. And he became known as a rabbi, which just means a teacher in Judaism. He's just someone who was seen to be learned and had wisdom. And then what was happening was he drew his inspiration from the situations all around him and the difficulties of the people at the time. We were going to have a look at those in a minute. But essentially, he spread his teachings throughout Judaism by travelling widely. Throughout the Jewish people within Eastern Europe by travelling widely, and he's seen as the founder of the Hasidic movement. So Eastern Europe is where we see the founding of the Hasidic movement by Baal Shem Tov, and this is where you can see there that pale colour in the middle. It's called the Pale of Settlement. It's just the title that they give to a place where most of these Jewish people were living at the time. Eastern Europe, sort of between the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and Russia, which is kind of where modern-day Poland is, amongst other places, was where a lot of Jewish people were living at this time, and they were essentially being persecuted by certain groups over a very long period of time. And also their economic situation was pretty dire. There'd been lots of famine. Lots of people were in stark poverty. People were hungry. And there'd been these things which we call pogroms, which are sort of organised uprisings against the Jewish people and killing them and those sorts of things. As a result of all of this, the Jewish people weren't in a particularly good place spiritually. What had happened as well as this is that we also had the Jewish people are looking for a Messiah. They're waiting for a Messiah. They've been told in the scripture that a Messiah will come and that will transform all of Judaism into something else, or bring out the sort of heyday of Judaism. And in Christianity, we believe that's already happened with Jesus, but in Judaism, they're still waiting for the Messiah. And what had happened in this time, or a little bit before this time, is before Baal Shem Tov's time, is that we had someone proclaiming to be the Messiah, and then he failed. He turned out not to be the Messiah. So what he did was essentially got everyone's hopes up, and everyone was very excited of this Messiah coming, particularly in such horrible circumstances with the poverty and the massacres and those sorts of things. And so when he didn't come, people were very upset and obviously very disillusioned with their religion. So this is a climate that we've got the Baal Shem Tov being born into. And on top of that, what was kind of really dominant at the time was this idea of rabbinic Judaism, which means that the rabbis, the teachers, the holders of the wisdom, I suppose, the learned people within society were the ones who were seen to be closest to God. And the only way that you could really be close to God in this time period was to really to know the scriptures and to be able to read the Hebrew and to be able to recite the scriptures. That's how you were close to God. That was the only way you could really be close to God in this time period. Now, with all the poverty that was rampant at the time, that was impossible for most people. That was really, really difficult. So what Baal Shem Tov was teaching at the time was that this wasn't necessarily needed to be a good Jewish person, to be able to know God and to be able to worship God. You didn't need to know the scriptures. So that was a new idea. So for people who'd been persecuted and people who were poor and people who had had a failed Messiah, this was a very a very positive thing for them, and something that they really saw as something that they could hold on to and latch on to. So what Baal Shem Tov taught was that rather than having to focus on rabbinic study, the reading of the Torah and understanding the scripture and knowing God that way, which was the traditional way of understanding God and knowing God in rabbinic Judaism, through the Hasidic movement, you could come to know God by your actions, through the sincerity of your actions, by recognizing that God was in everything around you and making sure that everything you did was to honor and please God. And along with that came lots of prayer and joyful worship. So you come to know God through your everyday actions by just making sure that they were performed with sincerity and to honor God. So what that meant for Hasidic Jews was that their prayers were lively and that they worshipped with sincerity and they did everything in order to please and to honor God. And they also believed that they could, in this notion of the Devakat, which means that they can cleave to God, which means they can become really close to God. So they felt God's presence in everything around them, in their everyday lives and in all the objects around them. They saw God in all those sorts of things, and they didn't need to focus on rabbinic study to find that sort of closeness to God that they found in everyday things around them. So that was a very new approach, and that led to joyful worship and those sorts of things. So as you can see with the map here, Hasidim spread quite rapidly. You can see it from 1730 to 60 there in that dark red section, and then the lighter pink section from 1760 to 75. Then from 1775 to 1815, you can see it spreading even more widely. And essentially what we have now is that there are Hasidic groups all throughout the world, and they're very welcoming to other Jewish people and to other people in general as well. So they've spread essentially all throughout the world. And if you wanted to look at where they are today in Australia in particular, then there is quite a large Hasidic presence in Bondi. And you can note the Jewish people who are Hasidic because they wear the side curls and they wear the dark clothing and the beards in the men, and the women would have their head covered and those sorts of things. But you can see that the Hasidim spread so quickly because of the situation where people were. It was born into a situation where people were really struggling with poverty, really struggling with the dominance of intellectual rabbinic Judaism, and feeling really left out of their own religion. So it was very popular for those reasons. It wasn't popular with everyone. There was a group called the Misnatim, which were rabbis who didn't like the idea of the Hasidim and the movement away from rabbinic study, and so they sort of opposed the ideas of the Hasidim, but they have become sort of now sort of reconciled with the rest of Judaism, and most the whole idea is now that for Jewish people it's considered an ultra orthodox group within Judaism, but it's more than accepted group within Judaism as well. So Hasidim today has spread, as I said before, throughout the world. There are some big groups like the Chabad Lubavitchers, which is one big group of Hasidic Jews who are spread throughout the world. So they're a part within the Hasidic world. And there are other large groups of Hasidic Jews, and they are sort of noted because of what they wear, because what they wear is contrasted to most other sort of Reformed Jews. They do wear dark clothing. Their clothing mimics what they would have worn back in 18th century Eastern Europe. Men you'll see wearing the hats, dark clothing, and the hats and coats and beards, and side curls and those sorts of things. And women also are very modest in their clothing too, and that comes down to sort of that, in everything you do, you're respecting God in what you're wearing and how you're conducting your everyday life. But on top of that, they still have very lively worship and those sorts of things. So it is considered an ultra-Orthodox movement, but it has reconciled itself with the rest of Judaism in that it is now obviously very accepted, just a group within Judaism. And we do see groups throughout the world. There's a large Hasidic population in New York. There's, as I said before, a large Hasidic population in Bondi and elsewhere throughout the world. There are big Hasidic populations of Jews. So we had to have a bit of an understanding of Hassidim because that will come into play when we look at what Martin Buber does in his career, because he does study Hassidim. He wasn't a Hasidic Jew. He was, in fact, he didn't have much to do with his own faith as a Jew, but he came to study Baal Shem Tov and the early writings of the Hasids, and so we do need to have a bit of an understanding of Hasidim so that we can understand Martin Buber. So in terms of Martin Buber's background, we look at his birth and the context of his life in general. We look at his separation from his parents, the impact of his grandparents, what he did in his early career, his relationship with Franz Rosenzweig, his emigration to Palestine, how he was involved in teaching and education, and also his Zionist beliefs and the Zionist movement, which is the belief in the creation of a state of Israel for Jewish people. So the first thing we'll look at is Martin Buber's birth and context, and we need to look at firstly where he was born, and he was born down here in Austria, in Vienna, Austria, which was at the time a cultural hub of Europe, essentially, where music was becoming very, very popular there, and was some of the best music in the world at the time was coming out of Austria, as well as literature and art and theatre were very popular there at the time. So it was a bit of a cultural heartland in Europe there. And he was born in 1878, which was a period of following a lot of great turmoil in this period where we had lots of revolutions in different countries becoming republics, and overthrowing kingdoms and those sorts of things. So it was a very interesting period to be in Europe at the time, and in particular in Austria at the time we have lots of new thoughts and ideas coming out, in particular in the world of psychology. It was a growing sort of branch of the sciences, so to speak, and Vienna was the home of some of the most important thinkers in psychology at the time, and that had an impact on Martin Buber. For example, you have guys like Otto Weininger and Sigmund Freud. They're two great psychologists who were writing at the time, and they would have had an influence on Martin Buber as well. So Martin Buber's parents separated in 1882, and rather than going to live with either one of them, he went to live with his paternal grandparents in Lemberg, and his paternal grandparents were Solomon and Adele Buber. And this is Solomon Buber that you can see there in the image. And Solomon Buber was what Martin Buber described as a master of the old Haskalah, which means that he was a master of sort of education within his own right. And while he wasn't an Orthodox Jew, by any stretch of the imagination, he was quite well respected within the Orthodox community in which he lived, because he had done a lot of work for the Orthodox community in terms of interpreting writings and editing works and editing literature for the Orthodox Jews. So he had a bunch of connections with the Orthodox Jewish people. So this was really important because it opened a lot of doors for Martin Buber a little bit later on. So when Martin Buber started demonstrating a bit of an interest in Zionism, which is the belief that Jewish people should have a homeland in Palestine, in Israel, when he showed an interest in both that and Hasidic literature, what we see is those connections that Solomon Buber had, they became really sort of foundational in allowing Martin Buber to find a voice, I suppose, in society. On top of that, he had a fair bit of money as well, and that allowed Martin Buber to have the financial security that he needed to be able to pursue a career in education and in writing and literature, which he just probably couldn't do at the time without a benefactor. So Buber was also taught by his grandmother Adele, and she taught him a whole bunch of different languages too: Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, German, Greek, Latin, French, Italian, and also foundational English too, which probably had an impact on his own examination of literature and his focus on what words mean and how words can be interpreted as well. So in 1900, after finishing his study, Buber moved to Berlin, which was the capital of Germany, and he met other influential people like Gustav Landauer, who was an anarchist at the time. And in 1901, he became the editor of the Zionist journal called Die Welt, which was his period of focusing on the Zionistic movement. And he also continued in that role for a number of different years, but then he was also quite positive towards the Jewish war effort, and in 1916, Landauer publicly criticised him because he was positive towards the war effort, which he didn't think was appropriate, and that was influential because that's when Buber had a bit of a shift away from these social mysticism ideas and moved towards what he became really known for, which was his philosophy of dialogue. So in 1916, Buber moves to Frankfurt and he meets this man whose name is Franz Rosenzweig. And he was an intellectual at the time, and he became very close friends. And in Buber saw in Franz Rosenzweig his intellectual equal, perhaps. And Rosenzweig is the one who convinces Buber to move into education and actually encourages him to become a lecturer at a Jewish adult education centre, and he also taught at the Frankfurt University as well at the time. So this is where we see a massive shift in Buber away from sort of political activism and more towards educational pursuits. And it's with Rosenzweig that Buber begins a very long path, which is his translation of the Hebrew Bible into German, because there wasn't a translation of the Hebrew Bible into German at the time. There was only the Hebrew Bible, and there were Christian translations of that into German, but that didn't sort of sit well with Buber, and he wanted to work with Rosenzweig on a German translation of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible for Jews. And when Rosenzweig dies a little bit later on, or not much later on, in fact, they only worked together on it for a few years, Buber continued on by himself for another 40 years roughly until it was completed. So in 1937, with the Nazi Party in power, and we start seeing more and more sanctions placed on Jewish people in society, we see Martin Buber moving to Palestine. This is prior to the creation of the State of Israel, so he was moving to Palestine before Israel was created, which was after World War II that was created, and he stayed there until his death, where he taught social philosophy in Jerusalem. So during his lifetime as an educator, he had a lot to say about education and about teaching, and he believed that the best teachers are those who taught by personal example to their students. So they should be assessing their actions and be conscious of how everything they do has an impact on their students. And he also believed that education had a powerful ability to sort of transform the morality of society. So he thought what he was doing as an educator was very positive, and he believed that the direction of society could be changed through education. And he also believed that there should be sort of a sense of mutual respect. So it's not about the educator, which was quite common at the time, that the educator was the sort of the be all and the end all of education and the master of everything. He saw it as more of a personal relationship, which we can see linking in with his ideas and his philosophy, which we'll look at in the next section. So he thought that that the perfect teacher was like a Hasidic master who offered his example to his students. So as mentioned before, Buber was always a supporter of Zionism, which is the belief in the Jewish nation state, and he was a supporter of the newly established city of Israel when it was created as well. And that continued until his death in 1965 in Jerusalem. And that's a brief overview of Buber's life. About 90% of this won't be needed in your responses at all. It's just to give you a bit of understanding so that when you approach the questions, you have the context to be able to understand what you're writing about. What we do focus on is his philosophy of dialogue, and we look at how that has led to his impact and contribution to Judaism, which is really what we're focusing on for Martin Buber.